We are lighting the candle, a world that works. Once again, I am Bill Correll, and I have with me my co I don't even know what to call you, Jan. My one of my buddy at partners in life here, and quite frankly, Jan Jeremias and I have we've inherited the lion's share of the heavy lifting and as far as the show is concerned right now, and I like it. I think we have some really good conversations, and along those lines, Jan, do you have anything in particular that sounds like you might want to dive into today?
Well, I was thinking, Bill, and thanks for asking. I was thinking today that, it's really interesting because I think, a lot of our conversations are quite serious. And, some of that has to do with the seriousness of the state of the world and the state of people. But yesterday, I went up to someplace that's, within an hour away, and I did this art workshop with this woman. And I love being creative and I love doing things like that. And it was a beautiful drive through, past a reservoir. And it was just spectacular. And I got there and I thought how we need to take time to do things like that, either things we love or to go places we love, to take a break. And this is coming from someone who probably, that's a very challenging for me thing for me to do.
Yeah.
I tend to be a homebody, so that's part of it. You can, not that you can't do things at home that you enjoy, you can, but there's something about getting outside of your normal surroundings. And so I thought maybe we'd talk a little bit about that, about doing things like that, like, you know, other ways to expand besides for, you know, that sort of like self-development kind of, let's say, tendency, or what business tends to promote.
So I'm left with a couple of thoughts there along the lines while you were speaking. I was kind of left with this image of, somebody who's always working on themselves in their spare time. That kind of turns into work.
It does turn into work. It's kind of like I look at my health as like that. My health is a job. Like I have to, have to pay attention. There's certain things I need to do,
Yeah.
whether I enjoy them or not, and whatever. It's still not, it's not it's not something it flows necessarily. There are parts of it that are flowed, but yeah, it does become work.
Well, I like that. And I am still basking in a little bit of the leftover glow from having gone on a 9-day cruise with my beautiful bride down to the Bahamas. Well, we got back a week ago yesterday. And although some of it does seem like a dream, and there is a dreamlike quality to it, I still can vividly remember, the play part of it. The the fact that we were outside of our home, and I think we're very, very fortunate to have built this home together over the last 45 years. We didn't build it physically, but we've built the hominess of it, and the fact that where they say your home is where your heart is, and so that's all great, but I completely understand what you're saying. And let me just run this by you. I have a dear friend who is out in California, and she's visiting with some folks that she used to, kind of run around with, and it's in a part of California where there's hills and it's green and there's all kinds of flowers, and she's doing a fantastic job of sending pictures out here. And it's really clear that where she is right now, it's allowing her to think in a way that may be a little bit new and different for her. And not again because she's outside of her normal routine. And so with that comes a lot of possibility, to be mindful in a different way. You ever notice sometimes that this whole being mindful thing kind of leads you to some of the same conclusions?
Well, I just did a LinkedIn audio event with my fellow collaborator with who I'm on LinkedIn audio every week with her on Friday. And it was um, March is National Nutrition Month. And so she focused on physical nutrition, and I focused on like what nourishes your mind, like what nourishes you, which is along what we're talking about, like what feeds you. Um, and so in the things that I actually, suggested to people or just have you, things like you mentioned, like travel nourishes me, exposure to different cultures, different places, different people. It is a way, and they talk about it as a way to like really nourish your mind because it's the exposure to different things than you normally see
Yeah.
and the things you normally do. So whether that be traveling or like for your friend who's in California, different parts of nature, different climates, different, and there is that whole thing about different people because I really do think that people, depending on where they're from, whether that be within the US or outside the US, I mean, there's a lot of difference between, city people versus people who live in, more rural areas. Weather is greatly affects the way the people are and how much time they spend outside and all those different kinds of things.
Yeah, one of the I look at language and linguistics, and I look
Mhm.
at it from the standpoint not just of the sounds that we utter. And if you stop and think about it, people from all walks of life have figured out different ways to communicate and have enduring communication that will actually exist through time. So, for instance, blind people, they've got Braille. They've got some other things that they can do in terms of doing recordings today that can be transcribed into something into Braille, can be transcribed into other languages. So it's very powerful. But when we're talking about people, there's a whole structural language. And I got to say that one of the neat things about being in a crowded space somewhere is to just kind of notice all of the immediate reactions when this happens, when that happens, when there's a loud noise, when people are laughing, when you smell cigarette smoke or all these things that you don't normally have at home. It's kind of like coming down on you. And then every once in a while, if you catch yourself having a sort of reaction that is questionable in your own mind, like where did that come from? Or wow, that was kind of neat. I wonder if I could do that again. And no, you can't. You know, you really cannot do it again. What you can do is place yourself into a situation where you can do something new that's completely different that gives you that kind of a feeling again. And
And I think when you say that, I think about yeah, yesterday when like I said, I mentioned that I took that beautiful drive and it was, on the way. And when you think about like going to a place, it's never the exact same. I mean, I
right,
had been in the same location a few months ago. There was snow on the ground. It happened to have been this completely like spectacular sunny post snow blue sky winter day, so it was cold. And then being there yesterday where there were a lot more clouds and in general I thought there were a lot more people around this area, like as I pulled off into this kind of scenic overlook type thing, or went went on the side of this reservoir, and I was like, there were a lot more people there, but it was very different as far as like if you looked around, the lighting was different, like everything about it was different. But yet I still remember having that same feeling, which was this feeling of like, the awe that to me I get when I look at beauty, like beautiful nature. There is this kind of awe-struck kind of creation, like greater power than myself or something that happens.
yeah, being present to a presence that you aren't normally present to.
That's right. And I think that that's why, when I talk about things, and I think because if you talk about being present and to a presence, when we do something we love, we're in that same state of presence. It's a part of ourselves. Like for me yesterday, when I had the time to be artistic or if I get into that kind of space, and for somebody it could be cooking and somebody else it could be gardening, but you have that access point to a part of yourself which you don't possibly encounter every day, because I think we get very trapped in that kind of like efficiency model where we have a job, we have to get somewhere, we have kids, we have to take care of them, parents, if that's at your time of life where you're taking care of parents. And then where we have practical tasks that have to get accomplished. And these are opportunities where we get to be a little
Mm,
bit more, and which exposes us to parts of ourselves, which is usually what I call the highest part of myself, the part that's not colored by the ego or any sort of like judgment of myself. Like all I have to do is, just be one with my surroundings, or be with one with whatever I'm doing.
yeah. I love what you're saying there because it's actually a litmus test as to whether or not you're being present and mindful. If you're thinking about yourself, you're not.
That's I
And
that
guess what? As the Buddhists are wont to say, there is no you, so give it up. You know,
Well, I had
it's
this interesting conversation with a friend of mine this morning who lived for a number of years in China and speaks fluent Mandarin.
yeah,
And she was saying that in Chinese, there's no um, there's no word for like be like personal space. Like there's no word for that. Eh, and how we were commenting on that, like this whole idea of, your own space and, you know, kind of thing, and that they don't have a word for that. And so we were kind of talking about that, how that really is almost like to them, it's almost like a state of being, like, to like yourself is your own personal, to me, your own personal space. And anything like we would call like, it's there's delineation between, like she said, that they don't get copyright there, because to them nothing is yours. Like once you put it out there, it belongs to everybody. And which is a very interesting kind of way to live, right? It's just like, not to worry about, okay, this is copyrighted, or some sort of like, ownership of something.
right.
Like you don't own something like that.
Yeah, I think that notion is something I would have to stop and listen to several times before I could actually experience or internalize something that would be even like that. Simply because how we operate here, in my experience, especially, I got nobody else's to refer to. Um, y'all can let me know what you're thinking, but I would say that a lot of us listen to ourselves like what we're saying means something and has value. And I kind of gave that up a while ago. I'm much less worried about it having value than being valuable. Does that make sense to you? Like, for instance, I'm going to know that if I'm saying something that works and is giving you some meat to chew on, and I know you're not a meatitarian, but if we were in a conversation and you're not having much to say for a while, I'm probably not keeping up my end of the bargain in terms of partnership in that conversation with you. But I'm going to see value in terms of not what I said and you agreeing with it and being able to articulate it back to me. It's going to be, what did that leave you with that you now want to express? And that's where the neat part of the being mindful, and when you step outside of your environment and you change your physical location, just the mere thing of going and getting keys and wallet and putting on the jacket, when I'm used to being in the house sitting in this chair, if it weren't for my little reminder every once in a while, once an hour, as a matter of fact, to it's time to stand, Bill, I don't know, would I be here in this chair all day long? It's possible I could. So I love it having that little interruption, kind of like it's a me break. And I walk around the house and I notice what the plants are doing. And I look outside. And this morning I came down the stairs and I said to my wife, we got up, before it was light out. And I could just tell by the way that the moon was shining off of the ground, there was snow on the ground. And so I said to my wife, I said, you do know it snowed, right? And she goes, no, did it? And I said, yeah, it did. And she goes, how much is it? And I said, honey, you're going to need your galoshes today. And then I said, no, no, no. Yeah, it's just a dusting. You'll be okay. And she kind of didn't believe me. She had to go and take a look at it. And she said, yeah, I guess you could call that a dusting.
Yeah, there is, and I love to meditate, and I can get into a meditative space, like that very peaceful state, very quickly. But there's and in that way I am being very present usually when I can get to that space. But there's difference between being in a space or within yourself versus being being conscious of the world around you and being one with that. And they both have, I mean, I value them both and I practice them both. But maybe it is that, yeah, there is a difference at points, and the point that neither one is good nor bad. I mean, they're both, I think, necessary. But there is this feeling of being at one within the space you're in or wherever you are, like you talked about going around your house and noticing the plants. Like how often we travel within the same place and we don't even notice where we are.
Yes.
And all of a sudden you turn around and you're like, sometimes I find I do that like when I'm driving, like I'm driving or whatever. And then all of a sudden, like, I'm aware to some extent, obviously, because I'm driving and I'm safe. And I'll get to the exit and I'll be like, oh my gosh, like I passed like the other five, I passed five exits already. And I'm focused on the road and the other drivers and where I need to go and kind of the exit I need to take. That the other exits kind of like my brain kind of shuts those out for a moment.
Yeah.
And so there's a difference between navigating your home or an area with the awareness of like this greater, whatever you want to call it, this greater power outside of yourself or this greater perspective of something.
I don't know if I would have a name for it, Jan.
Yeah.
But what's coming to me is that I have these moments. I'll be interested in if you do too. But I have these moments during the daytime where all of a sudden I just notice I'm happy. You know, and of course, now that I've noticed I'm happy, I'm not in that space anymore. I'm in the space of noticing that I'm happy.
You're
Uh,
right.
and sometimes I'll actually do a little, momentary inquiry into, all right, so what brought that on? And I can tell you about an instance this morning. What I did is I bought a guitar. Okay, this is not unusual for me. These days, in the last 2 years, I think I've bought four guitars. Uh, one of them, I actually commissioned a company in China to make it for me, and it's got a grandpa brand at the on the top of the headstock, which is very cool. And this guitar that I bought it because it's the same model of a guitar that I had bought directly from the factory back in 1996. We were selling adjustable seating, for manufacturing, and they took some stools and chairs for inspection stations, and some other machine things that they were doing at the time. And I took guitars in trade, and that worked out pretty well for a couple of years. We didn't do it all the time. Sometimes they paid me. Other times it was guitars, but it kind of depended if they had something. So that guitar is sitting in my dining room right now. I bought it from a friend who I didn't know I was friends with, but I got connected with through Facebook Marketplace. Turns out this friend is the older brother of the gal who's been cutting my hair since 1984. So that's kind of fun.
Hmm.
the next thing that comes up is he delivers it to me at the end of his driveway. We both have Mercedes, and his is like a 1983 Scubby Go, and mine's a 2006 Scubby Go, and so we're talking at the end of but in 3 or 4 minutes, it's like we've known each other for 25, 30 years, and we've really only our relationship has been a couple of comments back and forth. So earlier today, I reminded myself while I was upstairs to come down with some strings to put on this guitar. Turns out that when he actually handed it to me, he said, "I looked around my house, I couldn't find any strings. There's no strings on it." He said, "But you're going to be happy with how this sounds." I said, "I'm sure I will." So I was sitting there earlier. I came back downstairs, and I'm standing in front of the guitar, and I could hear what that particular voice of that guitar sounded like. The one that I bought in the mid 90s, wound up selling it around 2010 by accident. Okay. My wife did the deal on eBay, and I was traveling. And when I came home, my favorite guitar in the world was gone.
Mm,
So I'm sitting here looking at this guitar that's newer than the one that I had, kind of imagining the voice of the old guitar that I had. And I started smiling, uh, you know, thinking about this man, Ed, that I got the guitar from, and all of the good feelings that surrounded this, like the energy around this guitar. It was just really cool. Like, I can't wait to put the strings on this bad boy and tune it, it's just to see what it sounds like. So that made me feel really happy and good. And then I had to leave that so I could come in here and get ready to do this uh, podcast. But what I'm saying to you is that I wouldn't have thought to share that with you unless we were having this conversation now, and you
mhm.
said the things that you said, and I'm saying the things that I'm saying. I like that in the world. I think it's a good thing.
No, absolutely. I think that as you're reflecting on what you just said, is this feeling of just, being present in a conversation, which is also this whole idea of being present
Right.
for someone. And if you truly are listening, and you're not listening to respond, but you're listening to take in what the other person said, realize how, like, take a moment to realize how it feels within you. What does it actually, trigger, but not in a bad way? Just like, what does it, you know, move you toward? And that's beautiful when you think about a conversation. Like, I always refer to yoga as having a conversation with your own body. It's like you do something, you're like, okay, that's how that feels, and then you decide whether it's worth pursuing or whether you have to lay off or you have to modify. But it is a conversation, it is a dialogue that's happening, but the dialogue happens to be with you. Uh, with, and when you're doing another creative venture, like whether that be art or gardening or playing guitar, that you're communicating with the guitar, but you're also communicating within yourself, like, at the same time, which is probably why music is so powerful, as is something like art, because not only are you kind of one with whatever you're doing, so you're having a dialogue with you're having a dialogue with the brush, if you're a painter, but you're also having, like, it's an entryway.
Yeah. So if you don't mind, having heard what you just said now about all of that and the relationship to uh, art and the other physical trappings of it, the brush and the ha and the ha. I would like to know, is there some way that you could maybe explain in language to folks what your process? You mentioned earlier that you can very quickly get into a meditative state. I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share some, spontaneous thoughts that you have about that. And I'm looking at you, and my belief is this is something you've been doing for a long time. Meditation's not a new thing to you, is it?
No, no, not at all. I mean, I've been practicing meditation, or some when I for a very long time, for over 20 years. But to me, what has, and it was never for me being attached to one way, quote unquote, being the right way.
Yep.
Partly because at points in my life when, let's say, I was really going through a hard time, sitting in meditation was very challenging. I was talking about this last week. It was almost scary. A lot of the stuff that, the feelings I had, I didn't really want to see. They were
Right.
painful. And then doing a walking meditation, for example, just being much more mindfulness and presence became really important to me.
Right.
And even a practice like yoga or Tai Chi or Qigong, where it's slow, deliberate movements focused on the breath, being one with your body. That's why, I feel like those practices are almost meditation and movement practices, which, so I was never attached to one specific way. I would say
Mhm.
the thing that stayed consistent throughout that was actually to shift my focus to my breath, because no matter what I'm doing, if I'm walking, if I'm standing, walking, traditionally meditating where I sit, or even movement meditation. It was this idea of being one with my breath, like just going back when my mind started to wander or my emotions got to be too much. I would just say, okay, go back to your breath. Literally in my mind, go back to your breath.
So while you're doing that, the mechanical steps of it, would you describe that as being in the area of going through a pre-flight routine that's kind of by rote? Or would you put it more in the area of this could be play and enjoyable to get from this place where I am now to a place of meditation? What are the kind of the thought models that you would be using while you're doing this?
So, okay.
I know that's an interesting question to ask somebody who's trying to think of nothing.
Right. Right. Exactly. Exactly. Exactly.
Yep.
Um, I think, yes, I think there are a series of steps that I automatically kind of take now. One is I shift my focus to my body and where and how I feel. Um, so that could be what physical sensations I feel. So it could be, okay, let me bring my attention to my feet and really feel them on the ground, or my seat on the chair, or become aware of my body, because so much of the time we're not really aware. I mean, we move because we do things automatically and we don't really need to think about it, but we're not really aware of our body and how it feels unless it hurts. And then we're very aware. So my first is probably to shift my attention to my body, and my second is probably I could, it might be interchangeable, but I would say then I probably go to my breath. So I kind of become aware of where I am, meaning surface or whatever, seat, lying down, whatever that is. And then I shift my focus to my breath. And then I just notice my breath. So then it's kind of becomes this like conversation with my breath. Like, is it forced? Is it relaxed? Is it shallow? Is it deep? And after a few breaths of doing that, it's kind of like you notice your breath shifts. There's this feeling of like it becomes deeper just by bringing your attention there. Um, and then I'll use different things sometimes, but I think those are probably the two that are consistent across no matter what I do,
Right.
whether that be walking, meditation, or whatever. Like I said,
I like it. I was listening to you pretty intently. Um, I've spent a lot of time using my old uh, meditative techniques to go to sleep, you know? So I would say there's like three different levels of, or maybe four different levels of conscious. There's fully awake and aware, for me. Then the next one is going to be at a place where I'm kind of like, close to the alpha state, fully aware of my environment, However, I can't will my arms and legs to move, that kind of a thing. Like, like it seems like my eyes are open and I'm looking around, but I'm not. And then the third would probably be somewhere between there and sleep, which could either be focusing, which I spent a lot of time doing back in the day, and that was being at a level not quite as deep as meditation, because when I'm in meditation, I'm not asking questions, I'm not, not actively thinking as much as I am enjoying the state that I'm in and enjoying the vacation from any stress or upset or that sort of thing, not interested into looking into deeply how I was feeling before I started meditating, if you will.
Mhm.
And then the last one would just be sleep. And that's where I give my mind over to wherever my thoughts are going to take me with regard to dream experiences and all the rest of that sort of thing. So the neat part of it is, and what I hear you saying is that uh, your practice is to concentrate on the breathing, and I do know that that's pretty commonplace, isn't it?
Mhm. I mean, I think it is just because, well, partly probably I think it's across many traditions and everything because of the breath and its um the physicality of the breath being related to calming the nervous system and things like that. So, and also if if you're not even aware of that, let's say for people out there, notice what happens. Like, how do you feel when you get fearful or something happens that you're not expecting? You
Yeah.
automatically hold your breath. Like, it's so automatic. You're like, you hold your breath and you're like, "Oh, okay." And so I think, or even just in a normal situation where you're nervous and you've got to get on and you're need to have a podcast or you're in a meeting, and depending on where you are, just pausing for a few seconds before and saying, okay, just take some deep breaths. And you'll notice this huge transition for yourself.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a really, but I think that I also get into a place, but it is a very interesting thing at points. And I had two teachers who used to talk about doing this all the time. Is if you're having trouble or if you sit down, is to actually notice where your thoughts go, not to sit there and say, okay, what am I thinking about? And usually they would tell us to label it either past or future. My teachers Jenny and Paul, to acknowledge their great wisdom. But and it's true, because are you thinking about something that happened yesterday or a month before or 5 years before, or are you thinking about what's happening tomorrow or next week or even in the next 15 minutes when you're done? So it's just interesting to notice where your mind is on that day of like, oh, how interesting I'm spending, or how curious it is that I'm spending a lot of time there. Like,
Yeah, and there's another kind of a corollary to that as well, Jan, and that is throughout our day. Not only do we have this is scientific, so we can't argue with it. It has to be so. Um, at least 80,000 different thoughts that are just impinging on our body. There's that, and then there's all of the other things that are stimulation from the external, outside, that cause some of those thoughts, and other ones that cause you to be distracted from whatever thought you were having, and interrupting that. And I find myself that when I'm in the mode of when I'll tell you what, when I've talked about astral projection, back in college. And I mean, some people went to class. I sat in my room sometimes, and really read these interesting Eastern philosophical books, and I read the Bible, and I read all sorts of things that were, my goal was to have. Was to have a body of knowledge that I could go into a situation. This is an 18-year-old kid thinking, but that I could go into a situation and then have something clever to talk about, right? And then when I got past that intention into actually studying, I decided, I got questions about this. maybe I might want to go and find some other people on campus that are doing Bible study. Not because I'm, devoutly religious or anything, but these are some interesting questions like what do these words mean, for example? They're speaking funny, in the Bible. It's not using the same dialect that you and I use on a normal everyday kind of a situation. But all of that said, I got myself to a point where I would just lie down and I would get quiet and I would find a place. Sometimes I could do it by either closing thumb and finger and laying that somewhere on my body where I could actually feel my pulse
Mhm.
and my heartbeat, and I would focus on that. And then I would anticipate the next heartbeat. And then I would notice that as my state got deeper and deeper, the amount of time in between the beats seemed to stretch out to
Mhm.
where I was in an experience of, holy mackerel, that took over a minute for the beat to occur. It really didn't, but that's kind of how it occurred for me. So in terms of all of that, um, when people started telling me what I was experiencing after the fact and saying, "Hey, you know what you did? You accidentally tapped into this or you accidentally tapped into that. And oh, by the way, I won't have to tell you how to do it because you've already, got some access to it." And I
Mhm.
go, "Okay, so now what?" you know, it's kind of a nice feeling that I kind of figured something out on my own, but is it useful? Is there some utility that I can get out of this? That was always funny.
But it is always funny because I think we think about it very cognitively,
Yeah.
and being a scientist, yeah, it's almost like the analytical part of it. And yeah, it's very experiential, very energetic. And so it's a kind of interesting because I almost find that once we label it, or if that's our tendency is to label things, we spend a lot of time trying to, even in the state, once we come out immediately. So you're kind of in a space then. And
Yeah.
it's almost like we jump automatically to the point of like, okay, trying to analyze it versus just being with it. I had a client recently who was going through a really hard time and I did a meditation with her. And I could just tell she got in this real zone. And then she came out of it and like immediately went into what was bothering her previously. And I was kind of like, and I just asked her, and I think she was upset I asked her this question, but I was just like, why did you jump right in to like to the state you were previously? Like, kind of like, letting yourself experience that state, for example, as opposed to trying to analyze it or label it. Um, and I love words. But I was asked to come and create a wellness plan for an organization, and I was trying to talk to them about offering their clients, some form of mindfulness meditation and breath work and everything. And they said, well, with the words you're describing, I don't know if they'll get it. And I said, well, that's because it's very experiential. Like, it's the equivalent to me of, yes, um, and it's not even so much so, but it's the equivalent to me of looking at a recipe and saying, okay, well, this needs that, and that. And then not making it and tasting it, because obviously that's a whole different that's a whole different level of actually sitting there and saying, okay, that was really good. I really loved that. It was really chocolatey. I really loved it. Versus looking at the recipe and saying, oh, it calls for this amount of chocolate. It doesn't give us that same sort of sensory input, the same whole body experience, which something like you're saying that state actually provides.
Yeah. Yeah, and while you're talking, I'm actually thinking about my passion, sorry about that, but, uh, not really, because I really love cooking. I love improvisational, making stuff up on the spot kinda cooking, and then really kind of, enjoying the adventure afterwards, and, I went full out yesterday, cooking a nice piece of sirloin tips, and this will be lost on you, but if you can imagine for a moment or remember back when you used to eat meat, I'm sure you did at some point, right?
Yes, I did.
So I took this beautiful piece of, sirloin tips are less fatty than other cuts, and so they have a tenderness to them because they kind of come very close from the tenderloin, right? And so that's already got everything that it needs in terms of being, easy to cut, very tasty, all the rest of it. So I started off by taking an empty skillet and putting some extra virgin olive oil in it and raising that up to temperature. And then I put some, a half a stick of butter into it and a bunch of mushrooms. These mushrooms were huge. They were at least 3 inches across. And I cut them into sections and then I put in enough there to about half fill this frying pan. And then I went and I got some sweet peppers and I cut them the long way, into 1/4 inch slices, and I threw those in. And then I had half of a red onion. So I just took the rest of that and I didn't even bother cutting anything up. I just threw it in and then let the cooking and simmering separate all of the little circles from each other. And and I just kept going that way and kept improvising. And then I decided, here's what I'm going to do with this. I'm going to take some rosemary. So I took a sprig of rosemary, probably about 3 or 4 inches, put it in there. I put in some more garlic and some other aromatics. And the next thing I know, this whole kitchen is just full of all of this stuff. And I hadn't put any meat in yet. I mean, it just really smelled wonderful just the way that it was. So I kind of enjoyed that for a minute, but it's the nature of mushrooms. If anybody cooks at home, that if you put mushrooms into a pan of oil, they will first absorb all of the oil out of the pan into the mushroom. And it looks like, you didn't put enough oil in. Just be patient. It'll give it back later on and it'll render it back out again. So when it got to that point, that's when things started sizzling. And I had a couple more things that I did with it because this is a half-hour process. I took the steak and I put it in. I started one side and let it go for about 45 seconds. Crank the heat up a little bit. And then I flipped it over, and now I'm tipping the pan, and I've got the rosemary sitting down in the whatever that juice was, that few ounces of wonderfulness, and I started putting that over the top of the steak, and then I flipped it a couple of more times, and I was done. It was really nicely browned on the outside in certain spots, but completely rare the way I like it on the inside. I was so proud of myself, and there was nobody else there to share it with, you know? And I just really enjoyed eating it, and I am in the habit of posting what I make and eat on, Facebook, and I do have some friends that are egging me on all the time, and I love all of them. Thank you all for that. But my point is, just in that getting lost in that whole process for a half hour, there was nothing else I was thinking about. Nothing else was coming into the space, you know what I mean?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that that's why I've always loved to not only teach yoga, but take classes because very rarely do other things come in. Um, it, it's a point of total oneness, I guess. My teacher used to say yoga is is the you know is the state or the recognition of like wholeness, of being whole and complete, and there's nothing missing. And that's what you described to me. That's what I think about. And I love the fact that you used cooking because I think it does tend to happen when you're doing something you love. I mean, kids have the ability to do that very quickly. Like if you've ever watched a kid who gets upset and has a temper tantrum and then 5 seconds later is laughing and like they're in a state and they kind of let that state go really quickly and they have the ability of like, okay, that's done. I don't really need to that's done. And then they move on. But also being around children, like when I'm with my nieces and nephews and we're playing and they're really into what they're doing and then we're having a conversation about it. There's
Yeah.
something that's like that. That's just like pure, and kids do that. They're really very much one with whatever they're doing.
Yeah. Yeah, and the neat part of it too, I'm kind of thinking of my own experiences in that area while I'm listening with you, and, I kinda remember, that the external stimulation or something that happens in the room kinda keying the kid into that next behavior, laughing, crying, yelling, screaming, whatever, and, the ability to change it quickly is because 'cause they're not in their head trying to figure out what went wrong. You know? They're not trying to figure it out. They're more or less, "Okay, so that's gone. Now let's oh, a cookie? Alright, let's do that." You know?
Right, and I like the way you say, "Let's do that," because that's very much how they are.
Yeah,
And not only are they not like, they tend to be able to, coming from someone who it was like, to do something, you have to have a plan. You should have a plan, and not letting things flow
yeah,
or just kind of evolve, which is what you were talking about with the conversation with another person of having saying, okay, how did this, oh, that's interesting. I would never have thought of that unless they had said that.
yeah,
And when I was doing the art class yesterday, we did something called alcohol ink. And so alcohol ink is kind of an interesting, reminds me a lot of watercolor. So
yep,
basically it's, you have to do it on a slick surface, so it has to be like glass or tile, or something, and then you put it on, and when you put it on in different colors, it will run usually depending on how much, but then if you let it dry, if you want to change it and you spray it with alcohol, it will go back into liquid form, and then
yeah,
you can do other things with it. But the interesting thing is that it kind of has its own, like a mind of its own, so you really, it's very hard to attach to a plan or to an idea. It's very much more free flowing than probably I would think of, like, let's say oils or acrylics or something. Acrylics are a little bit more giving, oils, or whatever. But it's just, there is no agenda. And coming from a person, with my analytical and writing experiments, and then you're actually, you're taking steps. Well, sometimes, life doesn't come with a direction book, and as much as we plan and we try, we realize how little we have control over what actually happens. And yes, I do believe in law of attraction and all that kind of stuff, but there is this element of not attaching to an outcome.
yeah, yeah, and there's, a huge difference in life, in my opinion, between process and formula, and what I mean by that is that I think it's really useful to develop a scientific kind of an idea about the steps to go through in terms of deriving an outcome, the as opposed to having a formula that will give you a specified result. So
Mhm,
for example, if you're baking cookies, you're following a recipe and the recipe is good and you do everything in the recipe, that's a formula. The cookies come out and you take them out when you're supposed to and they don't burn, that formula is now good. But if
mhm,
you notice during that there were certain things that you did, like for instance, maybe just a little bit too much shortening, because there's grease coming on, off of them while they're cooling, on the cookie sheet or whatever. All of that stuff that you kind of notice while things are going along, you can either, update the formula and hopefully it won't change the result to the point where you're dissatisfied with how it comes out, or you could regard it as a process. And I've always loved the notion that when people look at something, and I got this idea, from Buckminster Fully. Bucky was talking about how we regard transformation and that we don't have a good language speaking relationship with the word transformation. But what he was saying is that there is no information in a caterpillar that would ever imply to you, nor could you possibly infer that it's going to be a butterfly, you know?
Say that again, Bill?
So what Bucky said was the whole notion of transformation is that you have this, then you have that. And so for an example, there is no information in a caterpillar that would imply to you that it would ever turn into a butterfly.
Mhm, mhm.
So the whole idea of something happening in the process, and what can upset that is if something happens and the butterfly doesn't get, you know, let's say somebody comes along and releases the butterfly from the chrysalis while it's trying to escape, then it doesn't get the opportunity to fight and to fill its wings with blood and get everything out to where it's supposed to be so that it properly inflates. It will actually, the wings will be misshapen, and they won't fly. It'll never be able to be a butterfly. It'll just be this kind of a thing walking around on six legs. Uh, but the whole idea, and I took that and I basically said, yes, chocolate chip cookies, the dough in the bowl doesn't look anything like the end product at all. And they taste quite different, actually, you know?
Mhm.
So,
It's interesting that years ago, through the years, I've had probably 2 or 3 maternity nurses that have been students of mine,
yeah,
and one still is. And she at one point one day I was talking and she came up or she said in the middle, in the beginning, she said, "Well, it's the pressure of the amniotic fluid on the embryo that actually causes the cells to divide.
yeah,
That there's a tension and a pressure that happens and this causes the cells to divide and create and I remember thinking about that, and that what you're describing really reminds me of that. It's kind of like, if you the same thing, if you were to look at a whole bunch of cells of an embryo and having studied embryology, I mean, it is really interesting to see what forms first and what cells actually share commonalities with other organ systems, like, the fact that there are nerve cells in your heart, or in your stomach, like things like that, or brain cells. It's just this feeling of like no predictability. Like you wouldn't think if you looked at this mass of like, a 2 cell or 4 cell or 8 cell embryo that, it's going to develop into an infant.
yeah. I think the thrownness is to look at transformation and call it a miracle.
Hmm. No.
And although it may be a miracle, it's also very, very much a process. And interfering with a process can make a huge kind of unforeseen difference that in many cases is it's unsatisfactory. It doesn't work out. It's not good. It's not cool. But I love what you're saying. I had never heard this before, that the amniotic fluid and that pressure of being confined in a space inside of the mother's womb, is what actually is there saying, come on, baby, grow. Come on, you got this. Come on, and it's kind of reassuring to think that there's already a conversation going on object to object between the mother and the embryo. And I don't even know how to put that into words that would defy my language abilities unless I really worked at it for a little while. But I think that's powerful, and thank you for that metaphor.
Oh, thank you, Bill. And I mean, because it makes me, okay, we talk about words, and yes, I also love words, and I love to look up word origins and realize that some words that we've interpreted, really, that's not kind of like what their meaning is. But this idea of communication, like to me, like when you have two embryos, when you have twins, the fact that they hold each other's hands and they reach out to each other, and there's this communication. Obviously they're not communicating um through words, they're communicating possibly maybe through vibration and through like energy in some ways, but they have that ability that, I mean, they sense another being around them.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm not sure about this. I think some of our listeners probably have forgotten more about this area than I'll ever know, but what I'm thinking is there's also the whole chemistry angle of it too, in terms of exchanging enzymes in the mother's blood. They're all on the same, nutrient, network, and so not only are there neural input pulses or temperature or whatever happens to be in the amniotic fluid, but you're also nutrition and all the rest of that's going back and forth. It's kind of, again, I guess a miracle is the right word. It's really, it's pretty freaking cool, actually.
Hmm. Yeah, I when I was in research, I worked in OBGYN for, you know, I don't know, 14, 15 years.
Yeah.
And it was just this feeling of like it really was the miracle of it happening. And once you spend a lot, I mean, I think the more you spend in an area, sometimes you realize the preciousness and you
Yes.
realize the miracle of it all, which is pretty humbling.
Yeah, it can take your breath away. If you let it, if you'll just be present to, first of all, how special it is. And think for a moment, you and I can't be here. This is a virtual impossibility, which basically means there are so many chances against you and I being here. First of all, that we were born in the first place. Second of all, that we would do all the things that we did, all the wins, all the losses, all the stub toes, all the you name it, the win, I mean, and here we are having this conversation.
I was talking to somebody, I was actually talking to my mom when I was visiting her on the phone, and we were talking about some of the workshops I've been doing and some of the collaborations. And she said to me, "Have you ever met them?" And I'm like, "No." Like, I mean, I'm on every week with my friend Salar for the LinkedIn audio, but we've never met in person. We're on the like a number of meetings, and obviously we're now on planning sessions because we've done workshops together, and we do the LinkedIn audio event every Friday at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. But it's just kind of interesting that we've never actually been in the same physical area as, and just the idea of that, like you were talking about the person who you met who was your hairdresser's
Brother.
um
Yeah.
brother. Yeah, and the fact that the miracle of that, like, to me, that's when I think that the people we encounter are never by accident. Like, there's a reason that people have been drawn to each other, or people come into, I don't think it's random.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a strong argument for a dynamic design. And essentially, I think what that design says, what that makes it a little bit uh, less than predetermination, uh, and a little bit more along the lines of, here's your chance to do something. Is there nothing for you to do, or is there something for you to do? That choice will always be yours in life, you know?
Mhm.
And, with that in mind, if you stop and think about it, it doesn't mean that there needs to be an automatic response to everything. Sometimes there's occurrences that happen, uh, that if you take a moment or two and you just kind of let it sink in, there's some understanding in terms of what did the experience mean, you know, and there's some, and what did it feel like, and what sensations did I get from it, and what am I left with afterwards.
Mhm. And I think that, when I used to get very anxious after I would, like, let's say, lose a class. It, you know, s- and just realizing that usually that, and I'm not like some phrases like you grow up hearing or whatever. And I used to think, they're either hokey or it's like, and the one that always came to mind is when one door closes, another one opens, which, I almost don't even like, I don't know why it doesn't, just the phrase kind of like, maybe I think of that as a but it's really true. And having to pause and not go into this either panic or rush to fill it with something else. Like just pause and step back and say, okay, well, this gives me a little bit more, this gives me a little bit of room to play and just see what comes in and everything. But the automatic reflex was always like this feeling of like trepidation of like, oh my gosh, I lost a class. Like, oh my gosh, that means I lose money. Or, oh my gosh, I like to be busy or whatever it is that we have as far as habits or beliefs or whatever it is. It's just to like sit back for a moment and be in that space and say, okay, well, most of the time I would find that when I rushed to fill it with something, usually that didn't work out or that wasn't the right fit. It was kind of like I had to step back and pause and and know that whatever kind of then came in its own time and own readiness was actually really, really good. But it was almost because it was coming from a state of panic
Yeah.
versus that kind of energy of panic or angst versus coming from a more positive energetic space.
Yeah. It's like, what if sometimes there's just nothing to do, you know?
Which I think in this day and age, people don't like that whole idea. When, we tend to be overfilled like so much of the time. And maybe that's overfilled with information, but we tend to be overfilled.
Yeah. And that strikes me as almost getting us all the way back to where we started talking about this today.
It does.
In the what would you like to talk about today, Jan?
Right. No, that is very true, Bill, of what brings us into that state of it. Like it's okay to have space and I think that that's why just because you just got back from vacation and that makes me think that's why I think that I was always come up with these really creative ideas or I would always um, be on retreat somewhere or something, and all of a sudden these profound realizations would come to me about my life or who I was or how I reacted to things because I gave it that space.
Yeah. I really do love what you're saying. And in order for something to occur, it's either going to occur affected by a background of whatever's going on and what you're thinking and what you're, most occupied by right now, or you can step back and appreciate and try to see what it really is and measure it. How big is it? What color is it? What's it smell and taste like? And really kind of come away with a lot more than just an initial knee jerk response, like responding to how it made you feel without any sort of analysis. And that's where you and I talk about all the time, taking your experiences and using that pause, creating it first, and then using it to come up with a question like, okay, like what was that? Or now what? You know? And that gives you a lot of freedom and it gives you a lot of sense of okay, I'm grounded and balanced and stable. It happened, and I can either have a measured response to it, or I can have a huge response to it, or I can have no response to it. And those aren't just the only three. It could be myriad other things.
It can be a combination of any of the above, right? And
Yeah.
all of the above at the same time, in
Yeah.
a way. And I I love what you're saying because I think that there is this, and it's this this feeling of almost like feeling rushed,
Yeah.
and that's that's just comes from feeling rushed or overscheduled. And that's why to me like like yesterday is like from beginning to end was just this great day. And I'm not saying I don't have great days other days of the week, but I think it wasn't a day that I was scheduled to get up early.
Yep.
And I knew basically a list of things that I wanted to get done. And in addition to, going out and having fun, but there were a few things, but it was kind of like whatever I get to, I get to. And
Right.
whatever I don't get to, that's okay. And I have had a few weekend days that are very much like that lately, where I've really been kind of conscious of like, you know, I'm just going to let it unfold the way it's supposed to be. And
Awesome.
I'm not going to, stick to a plan, so to speak. And that's just so valuable. I mean, sometimes it's, in some ways it's like I feel sometimes like, oh, I didn't get enough accomplished. But when I looked back, I think to myself, I actually did end up getting a lot accomplished and a lot of things. I just gave myself a little bit of breath or a little bit of space.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, um, I don't know, from my perspective, I think there's a lot of places where we could jump off right now, and I do think we're getting close to the end of our scheduled time. But I
Mhm.
do think that one of the really cool things that comes out of it is um, I kind of developed a model with the folks that were working with me back in the 1990s.
Mhm.
And we were talking about, how people would normally treat every situation like a coin toss. It's going to be heads or it's going to be tails, but it's going to be binary. It's going to be this or that. And then I introduced, the genius of Richard Simmons, who now gave us an array of different things that we could do in any set of circumstances. And then so people got really good at predetermining what they were going to do given certain outcomes, right? And then after that, I said, so do you know that in addition to Richard Simmons' brilliant genius technique, you also have the ability to make shit up? You may not have the right card to play in this particular instance, but I suggest to you that you have the power as a human being in the matter of your own life to go and make up a new response altogether. And that was fun to see how that went.
I love that. Well, because it's so true. And when you start to like kind of let go of, let's say, either ideas of how you're supposed to act or so one of the words that, as you're saying that, and I said you could be one of those things or all of the above, is
Right.
there just infinite possibilities then
Yeah.
because you haven't attached to just one.
Yeah. And our mind can't handle infinite. All you have to do is go look at a particular um, you know, galaxy, a picture of a Hubble galaxy where they're talking about there being at least a billion stars in each one of, you know, the portions of it. And it's like my pea brain can't handle that. It's
Mhm.
just too big, too much. I think I'll go back to stringing my new guitar or something like that, where it's got a predictable way that I can hold it in my hands and know what it is and learn what it is and explore it.
Mhm. Well, I think sometimes doing things that are almost methodical and very sequential. So
Right.
I so I think of, oh, the one thing that comes to cross because I was at a client's recently, she had this big jigsaw puzzle out. And so it was just like putting puzzle pieces like or stacking cards one at a time or something that doesn't require a lot of thought
Yeah.
and just, you know, and an analysis on your part.
Right.
It's just, can get it's like go do something. And I mean, I'll be the first to, when I'm feeling particularly anxious or something, sometimes those are the best things to do.
Yeah.
Thing. So, just-
Well, with that, my good buddy Ed, I would ask you, is there anything else that you'd like to say, either in summary or maybe to highlight something, or maybe just a kind of a closing thought that you would have given everything that we've talked about today, or something else entirely?
I I guess I'm going back to whether you ask me if I have a process for meditation or let's say even mindfulness, is to pick, maybe to choose one thing that you do throughout your day
Right.
and see if you can be mindful during that. Just that one thing for, could be a minute. But, some people say washing dishes, something that a lot of people do every day, or brushing teeth, something that's so habitual that, something that you do morning and night, hopefully you brush your teeth. And so just seeing if you can be like truly experience that.
Yeah.
And I
Yep.
love doing that with, tasks like that. Something we've been doing for, probably from most of us from the time we're really young children. We probably begin to walk or whatever, or close to it. And, first thing parent says to the kid is like, did you brush your teeth at night, before you went to bed or in the morning when you got up?
Yep.
So it's something that we've been doing for a very long time. So it's not new. And start there.
Wonderful. And then write us a letter and tell us all about it.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, with that said, my friend, I'm going to bid us adieu with all of our folks at home and you in particular. And I want to leave you with um, my frequent message. And what that comes down to is you and I know people who it would make a difference for them to hear from us and to know that we are really glad that they're here. So, would you reach out either by a phone call or a text or a message or what have you, and just let the people you know and you like and you trust, uh, let them know that you're thinking about them and that your world works because they're here. And it wouldn't work if they weren't. So, if they ever need you in a dark moment, that you'll always be there for them.
Absolutely.
With that said, I'm going to say bye bye and we will see you soon. Thanks, Jan.
Oh, thank you, Bill. Have a great day, everybody.
You've been listening to Lighting the Candle, A World That Works, part of the Exvadio Podcast Network. You can catch every episode as well as the rest of the network at exvadio.com, the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, Amazon Music, and wherever you find podcasts.